Welcome to episode 8 of Hermeneutics. In this episode, we're going to talk more about Hebrew narrative. So if you haven't watched episode 7 yet, I highly recommend you stop this video, go back and watch episode 7 where we first start talking about Hebrew narrative, and then come watch this episode. If you've already watched episode 7, let's dive into some features of Hebrew narrative. There are features of Hebrew narratives that, if recognized, greatly enhanced reading of the Old Testament narratives. First, there's the narrator. So the narrator is the one who chooses what to say, and because the narrator chooses what to say, he is everywhere and knows everything about the story that he's telling. He doesn't share all that he knows, nor does he comment or explain the story as he's telling it. His role is to tell the story, and he's going to tell the story from his point of view. In a biblical narrative, the narrator will also often give God's point of view. So the narrator of the story is the one who is telling the story. And because the narrator is the one unfolding the story, telling the story, it is he that knows everything about the story, and it is he that chooses what goes where in the story, and he is doing it from his point of view. So when you're reading Old Testament narrative, you want to remember that there is a narrator who is writing this down. We've been talking, in the last episode, we talked a little bit about Joseph and his story. Moses is writing that. So Moses is the narrator of this Old Testament Hebrew narrative. And when he's writing it down, he is all-knowing of the story, and he's going to tell the story or unfold the story for the hearer from his point of view, but because it's inspired by God, by the Spirit, inspiring Moses to write these things down, it's also going to present God's point of view sometimes. So, for example, in Genesis 50, when Joseph is talking with his brothers, he says a sentence that is obviously God's point of view of the story. And so if you know and remember Joseph's story, his brothers were incredibly jealous of him because their father showed Joseph favoritism and greatly favored Joseph over the other brothers. And so his brothers were jealous of him, and so they decided one day they had enough of it. When the father gave Joseph this coat of many colors, this grand coat, they had enough of this favoritism of Joseph. So when Joseph came out to the field to ask them how to do it or give them some food or something like that, the brothers decided, you know what, let's kill him. And Judah's like, no, and Reuben is like, no, we don't need to kill our brother. That's very bad. And so instead of killing him, they beat him, threw him in a pit. And then when some Midianite slavers came by, they sold him into slavery to the Midianites. And it ends up that Joseph ends up in Egypt. And some things happen while he's in Egypt, and eventually he raises in the ranks of Egyptian society and becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. And so when there's a famine in the land and everybody is coming to Egypt for food, because Egypt's the only nation that had food during the famine, Joseph's brothers, end up coming to Egypt to get food from the Egyptians. And when they get there, they recognize their brother and they're afraid because they see how much power Joseph has. And at that point, Joseph could have had them killed. And so instead of having them killed, Joseph looks at his brothers and he says, I forgive you because what you meant for harm to me, God meant for good. God has used my life to save a whole bunch of people from starvation. And it wouldn't have been possible without your harmful actions toward me. And so Joseph tells them God's point of view. So Moses uses some dialogue of Joseph in the situation with his brothers to display or communicate God's point of view in the situation. And that is, what you meant for harm for me, God actually meant for good for hundreds and hundreds of others. And so you can see the narrator at that point is using dialogue to express God's point of view. So the narrator decides what is being told in the story, how it's being told, how fast it's being told, and the narrator's job is to tell the story. He's not going to stop and explain things. So when you're reading Old Testament narrative, don't expect the narrator to stop and go, this is what this means. It's not going to happen. Or they're not going to stop the story and say, okay, reader, this is God's point of view. right there. It's not going to happen. The narrator is going to use dialogue or situations of a character to express what is happening, why it's happening, and God's point of view of the happening. So the first characteristic of Hebrew narrative is the narrator. The second one is scenes. So the story is not going to be built upon or around characters. They're going to be built scene by scene. So rather than building a story around the characters, the mode of Hebrew narratives is scenic. Action is moved along by a series of scenes, kind of like a movie, or better, a TV show. So if you think of your favorite TV show, you know that there's these scenes. The main characters, the writers of these TV shows is scene by scene put together to create one 30-minute or hour-long TV show. And so that's kind of how Hebrew narrative works. It's not like a movie where a movie, you go from beginning to end of the movie and you see character development through the character all throughout. It's more like a TV show. So Hebrew narratives are scenic, and each scene can stand alone by itself. It is the building together of these scenes, though, that move the action, or the story moves along from scene to scene to scene to scene, but each scene can stand alone by itself. So one of the narratives is the story of Jonah. So if you take part of the story of Jonah, and we like to often stop the story of Jonah when we're reading it at when the whale spits him back up. And the reason why we're able to stop there is because that scene has integrity on its own. We can stop the scene there and go, Jonah was in the fish for this amount of time, and this is what happened while he was in the fish, and then the fish spits him up. And we forget that there's a beginning to the story about why he was even there. Because each of these scenes from beginning to end of the book of Jonah, you can take each of those scenes and talk about it and discuss it. And it's the putting together of the scenes of Jonah's life that you're able to see what God is doing through this story. So scene by scene is how the story is built. It's not built on or around the characters. So each scene builds upon each other. The separate scenes make up the story when you put them all together. So the story is built on this scene by scene flow, and not necessarily built on character development. We do see character development. We do see that happening because characters are important, but that's not how the story is built. So narrator, scenes. Hebrew stories are scenic, and then the characters. And the characters are really important because they're the central element of the story. And the characters in Hebrew narratives are not described with their physical appearances. So usually the narrator is not going to describe a character to you at all, and if they do, it's going to be based on their status or who they are as people, and not necessarily their physical appearance or physical abilities. So when a narrator decides to tell you something about a character's physical appearance or abilities, you need to make a note of it, because it's not by accident, it's on purpose. For example, there's this dude in the Old Testament that's left-handed, and there's a significant reason why he's left-handed, and the narrator tells the reader that he's left-handed, and then later we see why, because he goes and wants an audience with the evil king of a foreign nation. And because this guy's left-handed, his sword is on the opposite side of where the guards usually check for a sword. So the guards only pat him down on this side. Well, if he's left-handed, he's going to pull that sword from his right hip. Well, they don't pat down his right hip because people don't usually carry their swords on their right hip. They carry them on their left hip so they can take their right hand and pull it out like that. So this guy is left-handed, and the narrator tells you that he's left-handed because he's going to enter into the king's area with his sword still on him after the guards have pat down his left side instead of his right side. And so when a narrator decides to tell you something physical about a character, you need to make a note of it because it's important, because they don't usually do that. They usually only emphasize the status of a character, who they are and what they do. So characters are central elements, and part of that too is Characters are sometimes put in contrast against each other, like the story of Joseph. We'll jump back to that. The story of Joseph, he is often contrasted throughout the story of his life with his brothers. So characters can be presented in contrast to one another, and characters can be presented in parallel with one another. For example, John the Baptist in the New Testament is often paralleled with Elijah from the Old Testament. Mary, the mother of Jesus in the New Testament, is often paralleled with Hannah from the Old Testament. So characters can be in contrast to one another, or groups of each other, and then they can also be put parallel beside each other. So characters are important, and also the characterization of the characters are often in words and actions, not narrator descriptions. So like I've already said, a narrator is not going to spend a lot of time in a Hebrew narrative describing a character to you. They're going to let their words and their actions describe who they are. So Joseph's character development, we see that happening not because the narrator has told you. Joseph went from being arrogant to being nice and friendly. Narrator didn't say that, but the words and actions of Joseph show you that he is moving from a kid or teenager arrogance about him when he was dealing with his brothers to somebody who is deciding right and good things morally. So when Joseph talks to his brothers about the dreams that God is giving him, Joseph does so in an arrogant way. If you look at that dialogue, you really kind of see that Joseph is not altogether innocent in this whole his brothers hate him thing. He's kind of an arrogant kid when God is first giving him these dreams. And so later in the story, we see that when Potiphar's wife comes and tries to get Joseph to do something that he knows he shouldn't do, we see Joseph choose the right thing and choose to get her to back off from him. And then later, when Joseph forgives his brothers for what they did to him, we see his character developing, not because the narrator is telling us these things about the character of Joseph, but we see in his words and his actions this character development. So part of Hebrew narrative is the narrator is not going to stop and explain to the reader what is happening in the story, and they're not going to spend a lot of time explaining descriptions of the characters. They're going to let the words and actions of that character characterize them. So characters are very important. The story is not completely built around the characters. The characters are moving the action through each scene, though. Part of that is the dialogue. So the next feature is dialogue is a method. We've already talked about that a little bit. A method of characterization of the plot and of the characters is the dialogue between the characters. And there's three things in the dialogue you're going to look for. So when characters are talking to each other, or they're talking out loud, or they're praying to God, you want to look for certain things. For one, dialogue is often a clue to the plot and to the character of the speaker of the word. So if a character is talking, it could be a clue as to what that character is like. And it also could be a clue to the plot, the beginning, middle, and end of the story. The overall point and point of view of the story is seen in the dialogue. And then second, there's often some contrastive dialogue happening between one character to another character, or one group of people to another, and sometimes God to his people. So you want to see kind of a character's motives through how they're responding to each other. For instance, Potiphar's wife gives this short little brief invitation to Joseph to do something he shouldn't do, and then Joseph gives her kind of a lengthy response compared to her brief invitation. And that's a little bit of a contrast between dialogue right there, where Potiphar's wife says something short and snippy, and he gives her kind of like a longer, hey, no kind of thing. Contrastive dialogue, you want to kind of look at interactions and compare them. And then third, sometimes the dialogue can emphasize crucial parts through the characters repeating something or summarizing the narrative. So sometimes characters will repeat something they've already said, or repeat something that another character has said in previous passages. So if you see or hear something or read something that is being repeated, you might want to take note of that. Don't immediately just skip through it thinking, I've already heard this one time, because there's probably a subtle difference, or it's probably a summary. So if a character is giving a long speech, it could be a summary of the narrative itself. So you want to pay attention to that. You don't want to move through too fast through repetitions, and you don't want skip over summaries because they are often important things inside of them to reveal to you the point of view of the story, of the narrative. Another feature of Hebrew narrative is the plot. So narratives have beginning, middle, and ends, and the plot of a Hebrew narrative can be really simple, or it could be really complex with multiple subplots. So you want to pay attention to the beginning of the story, the middle of the story, and the end of the story, like plot resolution. How does this all come together? And plots in Hebrew narratives, plots can move pretty quickly. So when a narrator wants to slow down a plot a little bit, he'll start describing some stuff. He'll start putting in some more dialogue. When a narrator is trying to slow the plot down, he may elaborate and use repetition. So if you're seeing some description in some parts of the story where you didn't in other parts, or you see some repetition going on, it might be that the narrator is trying to slow the action, the plot down a little bit. And if that is happening, then a slowed pace is a signal pointing to the narrator's focus or point of view. So if the narrator starts adding in some extra dialogue in there, some repetitiveness happening, if he's adding in some descriptions of different things, it may be that he's trying to reveal to the reader or the hearer what's happening in the story, some plot points and some point of view of his. So plot is very important. The narrator chooses how fast the plot moves along. So that's an important characteristic to remember. So when you're reading Old Testament narrative, you got to remember that there's a narrator writing this story, telling this story, and he's not going to stop and explain it to you. He's not going to be overly descriptive of the characters. He's going to allow the story to reveal to you what's happening, the plot. He's going to allow the dialogue to reveal to you who the characters are, what they're like. And if the narrator decides to put in some physical descriptions or other descriptions of a character, it must be really important because they don't usually do that. So be on the lookout for these things, the dialogue, the characters, the scenes, scene by scene that's being built upon each other when you are reading Old Testament narrative. That's what these principles are applying to, is this Hebrew narrative writing of the Old Testament. So when you are reading the Old Testament, keep in mind the characteristics of the narrator, the scenes, the characters, the dialogue, and the plot. So in the next episode, we're going to wrap up Hebrew narrative. We're going to talk about some closing considerations. We're going to talk about some reading cautions. When you're reading Old Testament narrative, we're going to talk about a couple of structure features, and we're gonna wrap up Hebrew narrative by some concluding not just cautions, but also tips on reading Old Testament narratives. So come back for episode 9. We're going to wrap up Old Testament narratives, and then episode 10 is going to jump into something else. So episodes 7, 8, and 9 are all about Hebrew narrative. So make sure when you are reading Old Testament narrative stories that you are reading them in context. And to help you out with that, this episode, episode 8, the previous episode, episode 7, the next episode, episode 9, will help you read Hebrew narrative.